They came to his land with weapons and threats. They shouted that he had to leave. But they didn't know who he was. He didn't call the police. He called those he had fought with. Look what happened when the real squad arrived. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The truck rattled and coughed as it climbed the final hill, dust curling up behind its rusted tailgate like a ghost. The late afternoon sun spilled over the ridgeline, casting long golden shadows across the broken fence posts and the wild overgrowth that choked what had once been rows of orderly crops. Illy Morrison slowed as he neared the edge of the property, easing the vehicle to a stop just beside the skeletal remains of an old sign. The paint was nearly gone, eaten by decades of rain and southern heat, but the faint outline of the word Morrison still lingered across the warped wood like a whisper. He stepped down from the cab, his boots crunching into gravel and dry grass. For a moment he stood still, eyes tracing the land that stretched out before him, 60 acres of forgotten labor, inheritance, and silent resistance. The house stood farther in, gray with age, its roof sagging on one side. The barn leaned like a tired old man beside it, red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Ivy curled up its walls, uninvited but tenacious. The fence had collapsed in 3 separate places, and something coyote or desperate dog had dug beneath it near the east line. The fields where corn once grew in tall, proud waves were now a battlefield of weeds and dust. Yet in the middle of the decay, Illy saw something alive, something stubborn, something that refused to yield. He had seen that same look before in the faces of men who had bled beside him in places the country never talked about on television. He moved slowly at first, not from age, but reverence. This wasn't just land. It was his grandfather's legacy, passed down not through comfort, but through grit and memory. The old man had fought for this patch of Alabama earth not with fists, but with taxes paid on time, with harvest brought in before frost, with decades of saying no, when men with torches or lawsuits came offering easier roads. He had stood his ground in 1963, when white-only signs still hung in windows, and men called their hate heritage. Now it was Illy's turn. Inside the house, the air was thick with must and memory. Dust coated the windowsills. A photo hung crooked on the hallway wall. A young man in a dark jacket, hat pulled low, holding a rake in one hand and a child in the other. Illy stared at it longer than he meant to. The man was his grandfather, David Morrison. The child in his arms, no more than 5, was Illy himself. In the back room, he found boxes wrapped in plastic. One held yellowed newspaper clippings about civil rights marches, another contained military service records, and a third carried letters, handwritten, careful, weathered. He took them all and set them gently on the table. He worked for days without rest, cleared debris, patched the roof, cleaned out the barn piece by piece, tossing out shattered glass and warped tools. He mended fences, set traps for possums, and coaxed the soil back to life. It was back-breaking work, but his hands didn't complain. They were the hands of a man who'd held rifles in deserts and pulled friends from rubble. Rebuilding a farm? That wasn't hardship. That was healing. At first, the silence of the land felt peaceful, but it didn't take long for it to twist. A week after his arrival, he found the first sign, a dead chicken laid on his porch, neck twisted unnaturally, its feathers dark with dried blood. At first, he thought it was a wild animal, until he saw the clean slice along the throat. A message, not a hunt. 2 days later, he found a rope nailed to his barn door, tied into a loose loop and hanging low. Nothing was said, but the shape was unmistakable. Then came the note, pasted with letters cut from magazines. Leave while you can. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. He went into town, filed a report. The sheriff listened, nodded, scribbled something into a notepad, then closed it with a sigh. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no suspects. The sheriff offered a vague suggestion that maybe Illy should think about other places. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Other places, places where his skin wouldn't offend the soil, places where men like him were expected to fade into the background. But Illy didn't fade. He kept working, replaced the fencing, installed solar-powered lights along the perimeter, bought motion sensors and set them at each gate. He trained a dog he rescued from the shelter, a scarred mutt with eyes too wise for its age. Together they patrolled the land each morning and again before dark. He made repairs to the farmhouse, cooking over a camp stove while he waited for a new propane line. He didn't invite visitors. None came. The closest neighbor, a white farmer named Douglas with a Confederate flag sticker on his truck, only nodded once and didn't stop his tractor. The isolation was nothing new. War zones taught men like Ely that silence could be both ally and enemy. But in Crossville, the silence spoke in deeper tongues, centuries of exclusion wrapped in church songs and forced smiles. They didn't need to shout. Their disdain was in the way their eyes slid past him, how his produce stand remained untouched at the weekend market, how the cashier at the hardware store double-checked his ID even after 3 visits. He thought of the others, men and women like him, who tried to stay, to build, to own. Some had moved away. Others had vanished after fires or foreclosure. He remembered the mechanic in town, a quiet black man with an amputated finger, who'd once whispered over an oil change that there used to be 5 black-owned farms in the county. Now there was one. That one was being watched, hunted even. So he dug deeper. In the attic beneath a pile of quilts, he found a wooden box, his grandfather's records. Inside were maps, hand-drawn borders with initials and witness signatures, tax documents that predated digitization, letters addressed to state senators, and at the bottom a journal. David Morrison's handwriting was steady, even in age. The final entry read, "They want to erase our names from this dirt, but this land remembers. I will not bow. Neither should you." He copied the documents, filed them away in a secure folder, and backed them up to an encrypted drive. He wasn't naive. Paper burned easily, but memory, real memory, couldn't be so easily erased. Each day he rose with the sun, worked until dusk. Sweat soaked his shirt, caked in the creases of his neck and under his fingernails. His back ached, his knees creaked. But he never complained. He planted seeds by hand, row after row, humming low as he worked. It was not a song of joy or lament. It was a rhythm of persistence. He knew the language of roots, the patience of soil, and he trusted it more than any promise spoken by men with clean boots. The dog barked sometimes at night, a figure on the road, a truck slowing too long. He never chased them, never shouted, but he took notes, logged times, patterns. He turned his silence into armor. The house became stronger, the land steadier, and Ely, in his quiet way, became immovable. He was not looking for confrontation. He was not waiting to be rescued. He had already fought in countries that did not belong to him for people who never knew his name. This farm, this little forgotten stretch of green and brown, was the first thing that had ever truly been his. And no one, no message, no threat, would take it from him. The days passed, and the land began to respond. Shoots of green broke through the dirt. Chickens roamed near the barn. The dogs stopped growling every night. The wind carried the smell of life again. But still he felt it, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Something was coming. Not yet, but soon. He didn't flinch. He just worked harder. He reinforced the barn beams. He mapped escape routes. He installed a satellite phone in the attic, just in case. And each evening, as the sky turned red and the stars climbed into view, Ely stood at the edge of his field with his boots firm in the earth, breathing in the scent of stubborn soil, and reminded himself of one thing. This land remembered. So would he. By the time spring crept in, the land had started to change. The soil had grown looser, softer under Ely's touch, coaxed back into life by months of steady hands and patient labor. Shoots of soybean and corn now lined the field rows, and the air carried the scent of growth. But for all the progress beneath the surface, above it, tension had thickened. It didn't announce itself with thunder. It came with quiet acts, the kind that revealed themselves slowly, over time, like mold behind wallpaper. The kind that grew when no one was looking. One morning, Ely woke to the sound of distant barking. Not the sharp, playful kind his dog usually made, but something different, low, urgent. By the time he pulled on his boots and made it to the edge of the property, he found the east gate wide open and fresh prints in the dirt deep, heavy-booted. His 2 cows were missing. Hours later, he found them at the bottom of a dry ravine beyond the fence line, their bodies tangled in barbed wire and fly-bitten. One was dead, the other was dying. He stood in the quiet and watched the animal gasp until her lungs stopped. He didn't curse or cry. He just knelt beside her, pressed his hand to her neck, and waited until she was still. There was no note this time, no message carved in wood or tied with rope, but the open gate, the absence of tire tracks, the precision of it, it all told him the same thing. Someone had been watching. Someone had known exactly when to strike. He called the sheriff's office again. This time, the deputy arrived 3 hours later, a young man with pale skin and mirrored sunglasses who didn't bother to hide his impatience. He looked at the ravine, scribbled on a pad, then shrugged. Could have been coyotes, he said, or maybe the fence was weak. Illy said nothing. The deputy tipped his hat, said he'd file a report, and drove away without asking a single question. Later that week, as Illy was mending the fence with a welding torch, he heard the telltale crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see an unfamiliar truck idling near the far edge of the property. It didn't belong to anyone from town. Dark-tinted windows, license plate caked in mud. The engine purred, but no one got out. It lingered there for 5 full minutes before pulling away. From that day on, he noticed them more. Vehicles that slowed when passing, men who stopped talking when he walked into the feed store. Flyers pinned to utility poles for meetings at the Heritage Hall, a place that hadn't hosted anything but private gatherings since the 60s. He didn't need to attend to know what was said inside. The next warning came in the form of fire. Not a raging inferno, but a controlled burn, intentional, precise, mean. One section of his north field, just sprouting its first green, had turned to ash overnight. The scent of gasoline lingered in the soil. He found the charred remains of a flare tucked beneath a pile of brush. He dug it out with gloved hands and studied it under the rising sun. Still warm. He installed more cameras, wired them to a solar battery bank in the barn attic, set up floodlights on the perimeter and motion sensors on every gate. He bought a second dog from a rescue in the next county, a quiet, wiry mutt with a limp and eyes like old paper. The two of them walked the fields together before dawn and again after dusk, stepping over broken ground and scanning the edges where the corn met the woods. People began speaking less around him. In town, greetings turned to nods, then to nothing. The grocery store cashier asked for ID even when he paid in cash. The local seed supplier told him a shipment had been delayed, then accidentally sold. He drove 2 towns over just to buy bolts for his tiller. On the way home, he saw a new sign planted on a neighbor's lawn. Protect our soil, keep our heritage. He said nothing, but he felt it all, the slow squeeze of unspoken intent. He knew the language of sieges. He recognized the difference between accident and message. What they were doing wasn't random. It was calculated erosion. One evening, a letter arrived. No envelope, just folded paper beneath a rock on his porch. You won't win. They never do. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his grandfather's old armchair with the shotgun across his knees and the dogs curled at his feet. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the same rhythm he had grown to fear. There was no storm, no thunder, no rain, just that soft, whispering wind. In town, the legal pressure began. A letter from the county land office summoned him to a hearing regarding irregularities in his title records. The tone was polite, but the intention was clear. He brought every document his grandfather had saved: maps, tax receipts, handwritten deeds. When he presented them, the county clerk gave a tired smile and asked for more modern paperwork. He knew what that meant. They were looking for gaps, a reason to call the land disputed. Once that happened, it could be frozen, reassigned, challenged. They wouldn't have to burn him out. They'd bury him in filings instead. A week later, someone slashed the tires on his truck, all 4 in the middle of the night. No fingerprints, no witnesses. The sheriff's deputy came again, same one as before. He looked at the truck, scratched his neck, and said, "Maybe it was teens with nothing better to do." Ely stared at him until the deputy looked away. That same day, the mail didn't come, nor the day after. He drove to the post office and asked. The clerk said there'd been a temporary suspension due to road adjustments. No explanation, no apology. Then came the whisper campaign. People in town started talking. That he was ex-military but unstable. That he'd filed false paperwork to steal the land. That he was dangerous. One store owner quietly told him he'd been approached by men asking whether Illy had a criminal record. Another let slip that someone had claimed Illy was using illegal pesticides. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was isolation. He began cataloging everything. Every note, every act of damage, every slow-moving truck, every visit from the sheriff's office. He backed it up twice, once to the cloud and once to a drive he kept inside a wall cavity behind a loose panel in the barn. But it wasn't fear that drove him. It was clarity. In the attic one evening, while the sun flared crimson through the slats, he found a bundle of letters wrapped in cloth, his grandfather's final correspondence. One was addressed to him. The words were faded but legible. They will try to convince you that you are alone. You are not. The roots beneath your feet are thick with memory. Walk them like a soldier, stand like a tree. He copied the letter by hand and placed it in his pocket. Soon after he saw it, a vehicle parked near the fence line at midnight, engine off, lights down. When he approached, it sped away. But the next morning near the barn, he found a freshly killed raccoon nailed to a wooden board and painted with the word infestation. A warning, a threat, a performance. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't waste another minute. He went into the barn, pulled out the military case he hadn't touched since discharge, and set it on the workbench. Inside, beneath layers of sealed foam, were things he had kept not for war, but for the reminder of what war had taught him. Precision, readiness, endurance. He activated the satellite phone he'd installed months ago and made a single call. No long conversation, no request, just a name, a date, a tone in his voice that said more than language ever could. Then he fed the chickens, watered the fields, checked the fences. And that night, as the wind rose and the leaves shivered against the barn walls, he sat with the dogs and waited. Not afraid, not hopeful, just ready. Dawn broke with a stillness that felt unnatural. The kind of quiet that settles before something unspoken, a tension too heavy for birdsong or wind. Illy stood in his kitchen, the morning light pooling on the floorboards like gold paint, watching his dog sniff along the fence line through the window. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold, untouched. He hadn't slept. Not properly, not since the call. It had been 3 days now. 3 days of waiting, not for help, but for movement, for them to show their hand, as he knew they would. The night before, he'd heard a new engine. Lower, heavier. It didn't come close, but it circled. Paused at the crossroads, then disappeared into the dark again. It was a message. They were close, testing his nerves, but they weren't the only ones ready. Around 8, he checked the eastern field. The soybeans were holding strong, rows neat and full. The breeze stirred through them with the rhythm of breath. For a moment, the land looked like it had never been touched by hatred, as if it existed only for growth. But the moment faded. As he walked back toward the barn, he noticed fresh boot prints by the fence, the kind that didn't belong to him. They were wide, heavy-soled, and deep, made recently. There were at least 4 distinct patterns judging by the treads. They hadn't jumped the fence. They had walked straight through the gate as if it already belonged to them. He returned to the porch and sat in the same wooden chair where his grandfather once read newspapers with a shotgun leaning against the railing. The dogs settled at his feet. Time passed slowly. No movement on the road. No calls. Just the air, thick and waiting. He watched the horizon like a man watches surf for a storm. The sound of tires on gravel came just before noon. Not fast, not rushed. Deliberate. Illy didn't stand. He just listened. The truck rolled over the cattle grate, crossed onto his land, and stopped 50 yards from the house. A second vehicle followed, this one smaller, matte black, with a military-style grill guard and a trailer hitch. Both vehicles idled for a moment, then cut their engines at the same time. 4 men climbed out, all white, all dressed in identical black jackets with an emblem stitched on the arm, a white tree surrounded by stars, the kind of symbol that pretended to be heritage but bled menace. One man carried a camera. Another had a bat slung over his shoulder. A third had a pistol holstered at his hip, the grip visible on purpose. The last, taller than the others, wore mirrored sunglasses and carried nothing. His face was calm, practiced. He was the leader, and he knew it. They walked toward the barn like they'd done it before. Not here, maybe, but somewhere. The way men walked when they were used to taking what they wanted. The leader stopped at the edge of the driveway, looked at the house, then at Illy, a slow smirk. He stepped forward, boot heel grinding into the gravel, and surveyed the land like a landlord inspecting property. The one with the bat circled around the barn. The cameraman began filming. The one with the pistol paced near the field, eyes never leaving Illy. No one spoke at first. That was part of the performance, dominate the space before claiming it. Finally, the leader walked up the porch steps halfway and looked at Illy directly. He pointed at the barn and said something short, a sentence that didn't need to be heard to be understood. Then he pointed at the ground beneath Illy's boots, as if to say it no longer belonged to him. His face didn't move much, but his eyes carried the same energy as the notes, the fires, the kills. A confidence born from decades of being protected. The man with the bat kicked over a bucket of feed. The one by the field began to tear down a section of the newly mended fence. They were careful not to break anything outright. Not yet. They wanted provocation. They wanted him to rise, to react, to give them the image they'd rehearsed. Illy didn't move. The leader stepped closer and muttered something with a sneer. He spat on the porch near Illy's boots, then laughed when the dogs growled. The cameraman zoomed in. This was their show. But Illy had been in war zones where the ground swallowed whole units. He'd seen hatred in eyes that carried centuries. This was nothing new. The man with the pistol walked back toward the truck and retrieved a large gas can. He began to douse a corner of the field, spraying fuel across young plants. The cameraman followed, documenting it all. The leader gestured at the barn and barked a command. That's when it happened. A flicker behind the corn, a shadow between the trees. Not loud, not sudden, just there, moving with the ease of ghosts. None of the four men noticed at first. Illy kept his eyes steady. The leader, now growing impatient, raised his voice. The man with the gas can reached for a lighter. The bat scraped across the gravel. The cameraman adjusted his lens for a dramatic shot. Then the field cracked with a single command, not shouted but clear. Drop it. The leader froze. The pistol man turned, startled. The cameraman dropped his lens. From the corn and tree line, they emerged. Not police, not farmers, not locals. 10 figures in dark green and gray, gear tight to their bodies, helmets low, rifles raised but steady. They didn't rush. They didn't yell. They moved like one body, encircling the four men in seconds. No wasted movement. The man with the lighter hesitated. A red dot appeared on his chest. The leader tried to step back, only to feel the presence behind him. Another figure larger, darker, armored, lowered a weapon with a single motion and pushed him to his knees. None of them resisted. Not because they couldn't, but because something deeper broke in them when they saw what they were up against. Illy stood slowly, walked down the steps, and approached. The men on the ground looked up, their arrogance now cracked, their mouths unsure. The soldier nearest Illy, helmet tucked back just enough to reveal his face, nodded with quiet deference. No words needed. The four men were disarmed, zip-tied, and laid face down in the dirt. Their equipment confiscated. Their threats recorded. Their silence now as loud as the insults they'd hurled before. A truck pulled up minutes later, unmarked, official. The agent stepped out. The lead officer carried a folder with aerial surveillance, footage, background checks. Everything ready. This hadn't been a rescue. It had been an operation. One of the soldiers handed Illy a document confirmation of charges filed: arson, hate crimes, conspiracy to intimidate, attempted property destruction. The men were part of a known group tied to similar incidents in multiple counties. What they'd done here wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern. But this time, the pattern broke. As the vehicles pulled away, carrying the four men bound and silent, Illy stood at the edge of his field. The soil beneath his boots was soaked in sunlight. The soybeans still stood, unharmed. The dogs paced beside him, alert but at ease. The soldier who'd nodded earlier lingered for a moment. He stepped close, placed a patch into Illy's hand, a symbol, a reminder, a sign of something larger than any one man. Then he was gone. Illy returned to the porch and sat down. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of gasoline, fear, and something cleaner, justice perhaps, or the beginning of it. He watched the road where the trucks had vanished. No traffic, no sound. Only the steady breath of the land, exhaling. He took a sip of cold coffee, exhaled with it, and waited for whatever would come next. Not with dread, but with the calm of a man who had held his ground and found the world shifting back toward him. The quiet that returned to the farm after the arrests wasn't the same silence that had haunted it before. It carried no threat, no lingering question. This silence was heavier in a different way, weighted with aftermath and memory. For the first time in months, the air did not feel like it was holding its breath. Still, Illy moved through the days with a kind of measured caution, as if he knew that even justice, when it finally comes, can leave scars beneath the surface. By noon of the day, the men were taken away. Black SUVs marked with government plates and unmarked trucks arrived one after another. Their tires left deep grooves in the gravel road leading up to the farmhouse. Agents in windbreakers with FBI stitched into their backs stepped out and moved across the property with quiet efficiency. Clipboards in hand, radios clipped to shoulders, they walked the perimeter, took photos, collected statements. Illy said little. When one of them asked if he had any prior altercations with the men, he gestured toward a stack of documentation in the barn, organized and labeled in weathered boxes. The agent opened the first one and let out a low whistle. There were files going back a year, printouts, photographs, timestamps, copies of legal documents, even small audio logs on a digital recorder. Each labeled, sorted, and dated. The federal agents did not need to ask how long Illy had been preparing for this moment. They could see it in every careful folder and every calm glance. They did not treat him like a victim. They treated him like a man who had done their job better than they had. News broke within 24 hours. Local headlines gave way to national coverage. Black Farmer Survives Domestic Terror Threat was one title. Another read, Veteran Defends Land Against Hate Group. The photo that circulated the most was one a bystander had captured from the edge of a neighboring road. A wide shot of Illy standing in front of his barn as agents moved around him, arms folded, eyes focused. He looked less like a man who had just won a fight and more like one who had expected it to come. Reporters called. News vans parked 2 miles away at the end of the public road. Journalists hovered with microphones and notepads, asking for statements, reactions, quotes. Illy turned them all away. He did not need headlines. He had work to do. The burned section of his field had to be replanted. The broken fence mended again. The gateposts, charred from gasoline, needed reinforcement. He moved through the repairs with the same steady rhythm he had cultivated since the beginning. As his hands worked, the land responded, not just with new growth, but with presence. People began to arrive, unannounced, awkward, not in crowds but in ones and twos. An older white man from the edge of the county came first. He parked his truck at the end of the drive, stepped out holding a burlap sack of corn seed. He didn't come to talk. He simply placed the sack by the fence, nodded, and drove away. 2 days later, a school teacher from town came with a pie she had baked herself. She didn't ask questions or offer apologies. She only said quietly that her students had talked about him in class, that some of them wanted to visit the farm someday. Illy didn't respond, but he accepted the pie and placed it on the table inside, untouched but not rejected. Then came the letter left in his mailbox, unsigned, handwritten on lined paper. I don't know what I would have done in your place, but I'm glad you stayed. The handwriting was crooked, uncertain. The words were enough. Small gestures accumulated like morning, dew quiet, tentative, and real. For the first time, the silence of the county was not hostile. It was reverent. He walked the fields each morning, as he had always done, the dogs running ahead through rows of crops. He watched the sunrise creep across the barn roof and warm the front porch. He drank coffee slowly, stared at the land, and listened to the wind. He planted a tree near the edge of the field, a live oak sapling. brought in a canvas sack from a nursery 2 towns over. It took time to dig the hole deep enough, time to pack the roots, time to brace it against the wind. He planted it in memory of his grandfather, and for every name erased from county records, and for the truth that refused to die. He carved a wooden plaque by hand and nailed it to the post near the gate. Those who do not bow. No signature, no explanation, just words in wood. When an interviewer from a national network came, uninvited, she was told that the farmer was not taking questions. She tried to wait by the fence, holding a camera, hoping for a statement. Ely simply walked past her, dog at his side, holding a sack of feed. He didn't glance back. A few days later, a local black church sent a group of teenagers with rakes and gloves. They asked if they could help with the field. He let them. He didn't say much, just handed them tools and let them find their own rhythm. That afternoon, the field was full of motion, young bodies moving between rows, laughter rising. It was the first sound of joy the land had heard in a long time. Then came the boy. He arrived just as the sun began to dip, a quiet evening with the air thick and golden. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, wearing scuffed sneakers and a faded t-shirt 2 sizes too large. He walked up the gravel path with measured steps, his hands cradling a small potted plant. Behind him stood a man. Ely recognized him as one of the warehouse workers from town, a man who had never looked him in the eye before. The man didn't speak, just placed a hand on his son's shoulder and waited. The boy stepped forward and extended the plant. Lavender, small, healthy, rooted in fresh soil. He said nothing at first. Then in a voice barely more than a whisper, he explained that his father slept better now, that he used to wake up when trucks passed too slow, that now he didn't. Ely took the pot from the boy's hands. It was light but not empty. He looked into the boy's eyes, nodded once, then knelt and planted the lavender at the base of the live oak. The boy knelt beside him, watching carefully. No one said a word. When they finished, the sun was almost gone. The man nodded once, the boy waved, and they left. Ely stood alone beside the 2 plants, one rooted in memory, the other in healing. He watched the wind play gently through their leaves. That night he walked the full length of the fence line, checked every post, every hinge, every gate. He wasn't expecting another attack, not yet. But he knew how hate worked. It never truly disappeared. It retreated, regrouped. Waited for memory to fade. But memory had roots now. The wind moved soft through the soybeans. The barn stood firm against the horizon. The dogs lay curled on the porch. The tree, freshly planted, reached its branches toward the stars. And Ely, seated in the same wooden chair as before, arms folded, boots resting on dirt that had tried to reject him, whispered nothing. He didn't need to. The land knew. They had tried to burn him out, tried to silence him, tried to make him leave. Instead, he grew roots. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Watch the next video to hear what happened after the headlines faded. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, share this video. Someone needs to see it,